Welcome to the Space for Diplomacy podcast by Spaceport Sarabhai, India's space policy think tank. I'm your host, Susmita Mohanty. This podcast series features conversations on far-ranging topics such as geopolitics, tech diplomacy, international cooperation, and all things space. Today I'll be speaking with Juan Francisco Salazar, who's joining me for this conversation from Sydney, Australia. We will explore the intersection of environmental humanities, media anthropology, ethics, and ecology in the context of exploration of outer space, Antarctica, and perhaps Atacama. We hope to discuss, among other things, socio-technical imaginaries of space, sustainability and climate justice, and cultural responses to extreme environments. Juan, welcome to the Space for Diplomacy podcast.
Thank you, Susmita, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be in your program.
Juan Francisco Salazar is a Chilean-born interdisciplinary scholar, anthropologist, documentary maker, and professor of communication, media, and environment at Western Sydney University, where he currently serves as interim director of the Institute for Culture and Society. Based in Sydney since 1998, his work spans environmental humanities, media anthropology, and science and technology studies focusing on socio-ecological change, sustainability, climate justice, and extreme environments. Juan holds a PhD from Western Sydney University and a bachelor's from the University of Chile. A former Australian Research Council Future Fellow, Juan researches space imaginaries and has directed award-winning documentary films such as Nightfall on Gaia, The Bamboo Bridge, and more recently, Cosmographies. Juan, your work often explores socio-technical imaginaries of space. How do cultural narratives, art, and media shape the way nations and institutions imagine their roles and rights in outer space?
Yes, thank you, Susmita. I think that's a really interesting question, and it has probably a long history going back, and it depends how far we want to go back, because as human beings, we've had cultural narratives with outer space for hundreds of thousands of years that we've been watching the night sky. But maybe more related to the work that I do around cultural narratives and social technical imaginaries. I think there's a tradition in many countries, but in Europe emerging strongly at the turn of the 20th century. For instance, Russian cosmism, and then work in Germany and France in film and in literature, using science fiction and using other forms of fiction to imagine our connection to outer space. So before the invention of rockets, for instance, there was a lot of work in film and literature imagining and creating these cultural narratives about rocketry and ways to get to the moon, from Georges Méliès, adaptation of Jules Verne. So there's hundreds of cultural narratives like this that do not stay within the realm of arts and literature and film, but transcend in society and begin to create collective narratives of how we engage with outer space, what we feel about outer space, fears about outer space, ideals, etc. So that's part of the work that I'm interested, not so much in tracing those astrocultures, as the historian Alexander Geppert calls them, but also socio-technical imaginaries in the way that society's shared visions of the future are shaped by scientific and technological developments, but in turn how those developments in science and technology are influenced by how societies are imagining. So this is what people like sociologist Sheila Jasanoff, who coined that work, socio-technical imaginaries, calls the co-production of science and society, and how they are shaping each other and informing each other and not just influencing collective sense-making efforts, but also shaping political life and policy and what industries and governments are doing. And for instance, new space, the notion of new space that emerges strongly in the 90s with that like an ethos coming out of Silicon Valley in the United States. It's a kind of a socio-technical imaginary. It blends entrepreneurial, market-driven visions of space with colonization and privatization of resource extraction and innovation in rocketry and efficiency in rocketry. So all of that is not just technological innovation and disruption. It brings together an ethics of how we approach outer space and an imaginary of outer space. So when Elon Musk says that we will become or we are becoming interplanetary species, whatever he actually means by that claim, that is a socio-technical imaginary that underpins like a vision of outer space. So that's more or less what I've been working in those narratives. And there's other examples like in the 50s in the US, before Kennedy and before NASA started to develop the Apollo missions. Collier's magazine, which was a very important US weekly, had a series of numbers on man will soon conquer space with a range of images that were famously drawn by Fred Freeman. And some of those images in the early 50s, so the rockets that Freeman drew inspired Elon Musk's rockets, and the space station that was there as how humans would sometime in the future live in orbit inspired the famous space station in Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film. So these imaginaries are not, as I said, not just staying within the realm of art and literature. They are pervasive and they shape also technological innovation.
So staying on the thread of collective imaginaries, Juan, let's shift our focus to Antarctica and Atacama for a second. You've done ethnographic and creative research in both those places.
Mm-hmm.
Could you also share the collective imaginaries of extreme environments, of exploration from an indigenous perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's another angle that I have been cultivating, embracing, learning from an early age, growing up in Chile, but also I grew up in Argentina and in Colombia. I have been working in Atacama, in many parts of Atacama, not just the Atacama Desert, but also the Atacama region in northern Chile since the very early 90s when I was a student of anthropology in 91, 92. So it's been, what's that, almost 30 years, more than 30 years of work there, on and off. I have worked in different projects ranging from early childhood education to indigenous tourism and repatriation and land restitution, but a lot of that work with indigenous researchers and knowledge keepers and organizations. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Antarctica was something that, if I may be candid in the interview, was when I was growing up, I was like a child. I never learned how to draw, but I loved drawing maps, and I was very good at drawing maps. And I loved drawing the map of Africa, was my favorite, and the second favorite was Antarctica. And I drew the maps and I put them in the wall of my bedroom. I was like 7 or 8 or 9. And from that time, I kind of promised myself or wished that I could sometime go to Antarctica. And so in 2010, I started doing work there, and I spent 4 summers doing field work with the Chilean Antarctic Institute in the Antarctic Peninsula. So these two extreme spaces, and I think the adjective of extreme needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, because it's extreme for humans, but not extreme for microorganisms that thrive in those environments. So I've always thought it's interesting when I say, or people say, I do ethnography in extreme environments. It's such an anthropocentric view. But nevertheless, they're very different. So although that they could be extreme, the Atacama, it's always called the driest place on Earth with the highest radiation on Earth, that has some of the strongest similitudes to Mars because of that. And Antarctica, a dry desert, also very dry and high, and with extreme climatic and weather conditions. In Antarctica, the collective, it's a really interesting question, Susmita, because there is the Antarctic Treaty System is a system, it's a legal system that oversees the governance of the Antarctic. The Antarctic, as some of your listeners may know, there was a scramble for the Antarctic at the beginning of the 20th century. And then in 1959, there was an Antarctic treaty that was signed, in which 12 countries said, we recognize that there are territorial claims. No other country can make more territorial claims. These territorial claims do not mean sovereignty, but we recognize the claims. And after that, in 1998, there was an environmental protocol that was attached to that about protecting the Antarctic for science, collaboration, peace, and nature conservation. And in my work in the Antarctic, it was very interesting to see, and in the films that I've made and in the work that I've done, the force of the collective. People are living within a national research station, but in a very transnational space, creating a sense of the collective. And many of the interviews that I did, everyone referred to this sense of going beyond the national and this very beautiful, unique space of collectivity, they call it the Antarctic spirit. And I guess it's not that different from other forms of cooperatives that have existed, in history. But in this case, because the Antarctic is a quasi-extraterrestrial space, it has a lot of similitudes with outer space, and the way that the research stations are built are a kind of a stepping stone of how we may, in the near future or far future, inhabit the moon or Mars. So I guess the trajectories there and the relations are closer. But that sense of the collective is interesting, despite being no indigenous population to the Antarctic, unlike the Arctic, who has a continuous occupation or inhabitation by a range of people since time immemorial, thousands of years living in the Arctic. In Atacama, the sense of the collective is different, of course, because of in the place where I have lived and worked is Lickanantay people, Atacameño people, who have lived there for at least 15,000 years, according to the archaeological record, but, according to indigenous stories since time immemorial. And it's a connection to the territory, which is, first of all, a connection with water. Being the driest place on Earth, water is sacred for obvious reasons. Water comes from rain and mountains and volcanoes, and the mountains, volcanoes, and hills are the ancestors and are the custodians of the place. So each community reveres their own hills and volcanoes as ancestors. And the water flows down in the part where I work, the Atacama Salt Flat, from the highlands to the Atacama Salt Flat, where there's been one of the largest extraction of lithium in the last 20, 30 years, which has become an important critical mineral and commodity for the energy transition, especially in the global north. So that has created an interesting collective movement around defending the salt flat. So that's what it's in my film and more recent work, is how different communities, indigenous and scientists, are coming together collectively to defend the salt flat, understanding that lithium extraction brings some kind of wealth to the Chilean government as a public-private investment or business. However, it's creating an environmental disaster because of the use of water. Hundreds of millions of liters of water that are used because the lithium is in the brine, not in the rocks, like in other parts of the world, in Australia or in Portugal, where the lithium is in the rock. So that's creating not only water scarcity for indigenous communities that depend on it, but it's also creating an impact on the microorganisms that have lived for 2.5 billion years. Some of the oldest organisms on Earth can be found in the Atacama Desert from the time of Luca, the last universal common ancestor, maybe. This is the type of organisms that scientists are looking for in Mars, biosignatures of microorganisms like this. So there's a huge pressure. So going back to your question, I'm interested in those collectivities and relationalities that emerge for defending the salt flat and its human and non-human life that depends on it. So two different collective understandings in extreme environments.
How do you think the ongoing extraction activities in Atacama reflect, or how can we project the future of what might happen, for example, say on the moon, on Mars, when we have human presence there? I believe NASA has conducted tests for one of its Martian rovers in Atacama. So can you kind of project of what might happen, given what is happening here on Earth for us?
Yes, I think that's one of my interests is at the moment. Not so much predicting or projecting, but trying to anticipate possible and probable futures. So probable are the ones for me that are driven by governments and industries, and possibles are the ones that are alternative to those probable. Yes, NASA tested, I think, the two rovers, Curiosity and Perseverance, in the Atacama, or part of the testing was done in Atacama. I think was not only in Atacama. One thing that I want to point out, that I always like to point out, is that the place where NASA was testing the rovers for the search of biological biosignatures, it's in a place where there's one of the largest concentrations of meteorites in Latin America. So it's a place that is extremely dry. So geographically, it already resembles Mars. It looks very similar with red earth, rocks and sands. However, it's in an area with a 200-year long history of mining. So Chile is a mining country, like Australia, where I'm based, and in the mid-19th century, it started with silver, and it quickly moved into nitrate. So Chile was the largest producer of nitrate for Europe and for India, including India was importing a lot of nitrate from Chile in the 19th century, saltpeter. So there were 800 company towns that were built in that strip with very poor conditions, almost like I would call it capitalist slavery, company towns, but that's another story. But there was a big massacre of workers less than a kilometer away where NASA tests the rovers. So it's interesting how we celebrate NASA for all the good reasons, for doing amazing innovation that we all love. I'm not criticizing NASA for the innovation they do, but it invisibilizes other stories when they do the tests. So it could be good that they bring to the fore those other stories, because your question points to us above, so below. What we think we're doing in outer space is replicating what we're doing on Earth. And it's the expansion of the capitalist extraction frontier outside of the limits of our atmosphere into orbit, then the moon, and then Mars. So I cannot project anything, but I can anticipate that in the next 2 decades, what is probably going to happen is that this model of capitalist extraction, especially of minerals, will expand first to the moon as a stepping stone for then going to Mars. And I'm not saying that this is in the plans of everyone working in the field. So using the water and the regolith in the moon to then propel as a launching pad to Mars, which is cheaper and more easy to do. But there needs to be resource utilization and resource extraction in the moon. Whether we can do that sustainably, as many countries are saying they could do, I don't know. We talk about sustainable mining on Earth. I don't know how sustainable mining is on Earth. I'm sure it's less toxic than it was 100 years ago for both workers and environment. I have no issues in accepting that the whole mining industry has spent a lot of time in cleaning itself and its process, but I don't think it's sustainable. So we're still extracting billions of tons of critical minerals now from the deep sea. So in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there's a strip where there are permissions to mine the deep sea for nickel. So what we're already seeing on Earth is what is likely to start happening in the moon in the next 20 or 30 years, with the difference that in outer space, there's much less regulation than on Earth. And there's no people living, so there's no impact in that sense. So without some of the strict regulations that we're starting to see on Earth, which can barely stop this, I think in outer space is going to be much more difficult to work with.
I think I share some of the, I don't anticipate the way you do with your lens, but I think I have similar anxieties of what might we end up doing in these extraterrestrial environments that we choose to explore. So if you look at recent news, the Arctic is again becoming a theater of war.
Yes.
Atacama, as you have just described, has been in the throes of extraction and also analog testing and experiments with little attention being paid to primordial life, which has been there for billions of years. However, I do take some solace in the fact that the Antarctic Treaty of 1959 has been a case study in what can be done in a more transnational way and respect the pristine environment that we're in. What
Absolutely.
lessons from the Antarctic diplomacy, Juan, do you think are being overlooked in today's space governance debates that we need to bring it sort of back into the consciousness of all of us spacefaring people?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question because I did about 10 years of work in the Antarctic and then moved more into space. And now I like to bring the two together. And although there are so many connections and historical trajectories that bring them together, I also think that there's a big gap between people working in the space field and people working in the Antarctic field, and people don't talk to each other. So I'm glad that you bring that question because I wonder what lessons can be shared from one field to the other. And when I started to try and make those connections, I was told I was very naive, and what applied to the Antarctic would never apply to space, and that space had moved on from, the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Treaty, and now space was in a completely different realm and regulatory framework. However, I think the discussion is valuable and valid because I don't think there's any other legal instrument, that has been as favorable and as successful as the Antarctic Treaty and the treaty system in protecting 14 million square kilometers of land and ocean to be devoted primarily for science cooperation, not competition, for peace in a decade in which peace is not the word of the decade we are living, and nature conservation or protection. And more could be done because one of the issues of the Antarctic Treaty is that everything happens by consensus. They are about half 50-something, 55, I think, countries that have signed the treaty, but only 29 that have consultative status. So the decision-making is made by 29 countries. So there's 200 countries in the world. So basically 12% of the countries make decisions. But any decision is made by consensus. And so far, the treaty has allowed a sense of we can work together to protect this for the benefit of, in general, all the nations or humankind, although that's a bit of a stretch. One of the vacuums in the treaty system is microorganisms, which were no one was paying attention to them when the treaty was signed. So there's a lot of extraction of extremophiles for their enzymes and proteins for biotechnology. So there's a little bit of a vacuum there, and a lot of competition for discovering, the new enzyme that could be applied in other places, medical research including. However, in space, we have nothing like that. So diplomacy works in a much stronger way than anything that the Office of the United Nations Office for Space Affairs can do, with all the respect to our colleagues that do brilliant work through that office. But there's no treaty behind it to really support the countries to cooperate. Now, the problem with consensus, which in space we don't have any consensus, and the entry of the private sector, we don't have it in the Antarctic. No private company can go to the Antarctic to do anything, with the exception of what I just said around biotechnology. But maybe the shortcomings of the consensus is that some countries, for instance, wanted to create a marine protected area in East Antarctica. So that's where Australia, New Zealand, south of Australia, New Zealand. So they put together to the Antarctic Treaty several times. So this committee meets once a year in different countries. And it's always been blocked by China and Russia. So Australia, New Zealand, France, the US put together this, and two countries block it. So it will never pass because it works by 100% consensus. So those are some of the shortcomings that people working in outer space say, well, that model will never be useful for space because there will never be 100% consensus on anything. So that would limit entrepreneurship, that would limit, space tourism, that will limit, the search for extraterrestrial life, et cetera. So while there are lessons to be learned, I think both space and Antarctica now are on different trajectories, and it's difficult to bring them together.
I think the fact that consensus is hard is something I hear from colleagues around the world as well, which to me, if you look at the contemporary political space, is affecting multilateralism, quote unquote, as you and I, our generations saw it growing up and in our professional practices. So that's a concern. And the thing is, space is increasingly framed as an economic and strategic domain, even a military domain, rather than a shared human commons. So from an anthropological perspective, Juan, what do we lose when space is governed primarily through competition rather than cooperation?
Yes, I think this question is extremely relevant in the contemporary political context, a global context where multilateralism, as you say, is pretty much dead. When you have 2 or 3 rogue countries pretty much dictating in isolation how world politics is being run, and this is obviously affecting every realm, including outer space. So I think this is not the time this is the time to be trying to rescue or to foster or to strengthen multilateralism more than ever before. So I'm completely with you in that one. Especially thinking from Latin America, for instance, or even from Australia, a region and a middle power country, nothing can be done without multilateralism in space and in any other thing. I think from an anthropological perspective, I have been, my thinking has been influenced. If I could take a little bit of a route to answer this question, my thinking as an anthropologist is certainly shaped by the discipline and the humanities and social sciences, but my thinking has also been influenced and moved by biologists, like biologists doing theories of life on Earth. So I'm talking about Lynn Margulis, and her idea of symbiosis, which has been adapted and has influenced a whole area of anthropological thinking since the 1980s. Her idea of the Gaia hypothesis that she co-developed with James Lovelock, which is maybe new in the Western sciences, but it's a principle or an ideal that is common to Indigenous and First Nations since time immemorial. This idea that the planet is like a living organism. So this idea of symbiosis and that evolution happens not through competition, but more through cooperation has always been in the back of my mind. And when I look at socio-technical futures or imaginaries of outer space and how we're told they're driven by competition, and competition drives productivity and competition drives innovation, yes, to a point, but it also creates inequality and it creates division. So that's the other person, the other biologist is a Chilean biologist, Humberto Maturana, who I had the privilege to be a student of his in the University of Chile, and he taught a course called The Tree of Knowledge and Biology of Cognition, and he was talking about love and epistemologies of love and cooperation, and how societies and groups of people that come together to cooperate, they are bundled or glued by love, and how awkward in the current world it is to talk about love. It sounds completely ridiculous to be talking about love and honesty and responsibility as an epistemological perspective. But I think it's important to bring them together. So are we going to go to space competing with each other, or are we going to go to space cooperating with each other? So this idea of human as an interplanetary species, are we going to keep competing in outer space for resources, for land, for values, for religion, or are we going to build a different type of epistemology, collectivity in outer space? And the third part is, which is links back to your first question, and maybe your interest coming up, and I can talk about this later on, but it's Ursula Le Guin's, the writer, speculative fiction writer, Ursula Le Guin's. She wrote a little essay in the 80s when I was a high school student called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, which has also inspired the same anthropologists that Lynn Margulis has inspired. So, and it's the same principle, is we think that the history of humanity, the stories, are about action and heroes. So the male hunter that kills a mammoth and then goes back to the cave and tells the adventure of killing. When for most of history, it's been the gatherer, and also women and men gathering seeds, not just killing. So it's the carrier bag where you put the seeds and not the axe to kill that drives storytelling and drives human cooperation. So her theory of fiction, not as following an actor that needs to kill something, but a collective group of people that are collecting stories into a bag, has influenced me a lot in the way that I make films and I think anthropologically about outer space. So is there a carrier bag theory of outer space that we can think of? So it's not about conquest and flag planting and discovery of life, but it's about building a different type of approach to it.
This is brilliant. It gives me hope. So I think when your professors, the course you had, Tree of Knowledge, I think in our lifetimes, I say our because I think we are the same generation, knowledge was something we looked up to. And now in the age of social media, well, I would even say once Google happened and you could just go search anything on the internet, somehow the concept of knowledge being something sort of that we can look up to has evaporated, if you ask me. Now it's money that we look up to. I also wanted to talk about love now that you've brought it up. I remember I was in NASA Johnson when the shuttle missions were happening. And on one occasion, there was a fire on Mir. And I believe the American astronaut who was spending several months on Mir as part of the Shuttle Mir cooperation, Jerry Linenger, was up there. And I remember reading in a Houston newspaper, let's get involved because Jerry is up there. And my first question to my NASA friends who I talked to that day was, why doesn't anybody look at this cooperation between Americans and Russians as a friendship. Why is it that we need to get involved because an American astronaut is up there? There's also Yuri and Yuri. I mean, so I think cooperation, unfortunately, Juan, in the international realm happens, again, for strategic reasons rather than for reasons of love.
Mm.
And I wish we could bring it back just as we're discussing it here. I also have been fascinated with how you blend film, ethnography, and critical theory. Can we talk a bit about your films and how can creative and speculative methods contribute meaningfully to space policy discussions? Because it's often dominated by technical and legal language, and I think we are missing this, the love aspect in looking at, places we explore and how we explore.
Mm. Yes. I have the wish that the work that I do could contribute to technical discussions and legal discussions of outer space. I'm not sure how much of that work pays attention to this kind of work, but I'm always hopeful that there are people in those spaces and institutions and infrastructures that would like to listen or to bring some of these languages into dialogue. So I guess the core of your questions about is language. If we all end up speaking the same language, and that happens with linguistic diversity. So I forgot the exact number, but I think it's something like 500 languages disappear each year, or something like that. So if in 100 years we're going to be speaking 10 languages, the 10 most popular languages at the moment, we lose a way to understand the world, because you understand the world and you are in the world and you connect with nature and you connect with the beyond through language. So in terms of the technical and legal language of outer space, is the same. If we all speak the same language, on the one hand, there's a positive aspect that we can understand each other. But how much do we leave aside? How much knowledge are we going to lose or don't bring into dialogue because we're just speaking a technical and a legal language? So that's why I bring in, through my films, speculative approaches in arts, literature, and film that ask the question, what if? So what if we talk about this theme from a different language, or bringing a different language? It could be the language of love. It could be the language of respect for nature. It could be the language of how do we think we're going to live in outer space, or the language of how do we not render invisible that when we test rovers in the Atacama Desert, there's a history that happens in the surroundings. So I think that's why the language of literature, the arts, film, and now new media, digital media, including AI, could be interesting. And you mentioned the internet and Google. As far as I know, if you look at the history of the internet came about as an exercise of cooperation, not competition. Scientists cooperating, putting their knowledge, their very specific knowledge, together to create the internet. So it wasn't companies, and with public funding. So it wasn't like startups, competing with each other that led to the internet. So that's why I think that the language of the arts and music, music, I don't know, some of the oldest instruments are 40, 50,000 years old. So some of the oldest technologies that we have are musical instruments. What does it say about the language of music, for instance, and other languages? There's all these tests being done now. Sorry if I'm digressing, but about the language of mushrooms. So they put these sensors, mushrooms and trees can speak. So how can we be so limited, so arrogant to think we're going to go and live in another planet and we just speak English and we just speak, a legal language that's going to govern our lives in Mars? When on Earth, we know that trees talk to each other, mushrooms have a whole network. So I think that's why important, just to go back to the question and not digress anymore, that we need other ways of storytelling outer space uh, that can complement the legal and the technical language.
I think the multi-species angle, that's very much part of your thinking and research. Everything from extremophiles all the way to sentient beings like the whales and the dolphins and the elephants. I think we humans, the hubris that I wish we were to approach research and exploration with a lot more humility. Unfortunately, it's a lot of hubris, and we completely make everything so human-centric. Coming back to storytelling, can you talk a little bit about your films Nightfall on Gaia and Cosmographies? Those are the two films that I've had the opportunity to see. Can you share a bit more with our audience?
Yes,
Those
thank
two
you.
particular films.
Yes, thank you. And if there's an opportunity to share the links for people to watch it, I would be very honored to share those links as well. Nightfall on Gaia was a film shot in Antarctica between 2011 and 2014 and released in 2015. And it's the prequel to the film Cosmographies that was shot in the Atacama Desert between 2022 and 2024 and released in 2025. So there's a 10-year gap between prequel and sequel. Both are experimental films, which I called speculative fiction documentaries, where I wanted to blur the boundaries between fact and fiction, which are an artificial Western mode of storytelling. So in the West, since maybe, the 18th century, because in Europe, some of the best scientists in the 17th century were using fiction to explain their science. But, in the 19th century, it changes. So fact is one thing, fiction is another thing. But why? Why cannot we bring them together in a film that is partly based on science, on fact, in political realities, and some of it's a speculative fiction story. So in the films, I collaborated with an Australian Maori artist, Victoria Hunt, and she embodies a character of Shue Nun. I developed that name, and it has its own story, the name. She's a Maori astrobiologist. In the first film, she's in Antarctica in 2038, and in the second film, she's in Mars in 2051. And through the main story is her story and how she's reflecting on a specific world. So the collapse of Antarctica in the late 2030s, climatic collapse, political collapse in the 2030s, and then in Mars, where she is chief of a mission in the search for biosignatures in Jezero crater, and the NASA Mars Return mission found some biosignatures or fossilized evidence of rotifers in the film. And then she's leading a mission to study these fossilized rotifer organisms, which are the same organisms that one of the scientists in the film Cosmography is studying. So the two films are a metaphor one for Antarctica and one for Atacama, and their connection to outer space and what happens below happens above. The fact that outer space is a misnomer. There's no outer space. The Earth is not outer from space. The Earth is part of a solar system. So the Earth is very much within the solar system. So outer space doesn't exist. And the fiction carries a story about, the sentient beings. So the rocks in Mars are not just rocks to be drilled. They have a geological sentience. The dust storms in Mars have some kind of agency and sentience, planet engulfing dust storms, the microorganisms, etc. So I'm trying to create a story that it's not only about colonization and resource extraction, but more stories that are connected with indigenous knowledges of earth and sky country. And you don't need to identify or belong to an indigenous nation or community to feel a connection with nature. That's we were talking about tree hugging before we started the interview, how tree bathing is so important in Japan. However, indigenous nations have systems of knowledge that are thousands of years old, with hundreds of thousands of stories that give meaning to this connection. So that's the difference between you as an individual having a connection to a tree and the water next to where you live, and having a whole system of knowledge and stories and language to support that connection. So what I'm trying to do with my films is to create those stories of connection to these extreme environments on Earth, which are very fragile, which are on the brink of collapse, and that also are anticipating what we think can happen in outer space. And why do we need to address this before it happens? So if the Atacama Desert has scars of 200 years of non-stop mining, is this how Mars is going to, or the moon is going to look in 200 years from now? One derelict abandoned mine after the other one. So if you travel for 800 kilometers in the north of Chile, you can see, I don't know, hundreds of saltpeter mines abandoned or reused. You can see the scars and the wounds on the body of that desert. Is this what we are going to be seeing in Mars in 200 years? Maybe, maybe not. But these stories are meant to move you, to make you cry, to make you feel love, to make you feel, not just think, but also make you feel, and work at that realm of the sensory is very important for me as well.
So I think if you were advising diplomats and policymakers shaping the next generation of space governance, what questions should they be asking now that they aren't asking yet?
Wow, that's such a tricky question, and I don't know. But one question that I have is that the idea that outer space is empty, it's another terra nullius. We've made that mistake before. When the British came to India, when the British came to Australia, when the Spanish came to the Americas, the scramble for Africa, this idea that this is an emptiness to be explored, colonized, extracted. So some of the questions that I think are still not at the forefront is that, what if we shift the question and started to think about the space as not empty? Of course, we have not found life, but it's not empty of physical and chemical processes. So the biological part is still maybe missing. But what if we embrace an older wisdom that indigenous people carry, that the sky or outer space is not empty? For me, that's a very big question, because if we find life in a new universe that we thought was empty, it's quite different to if we find life in a universe that, in a cosmos that it was never empty. It could be a philosophical question that no one cares, for in space governance, because space governance needs norms to follow and rules for everyone to follow, and legislation. But I think it's a big question that is not being asked yet, that I think it's important. And if it's being asked, is not at the forefront of some of the other pressing questions. Of course, we need a solution to the energy crisis. Of course, we need to think how we can reduce consumption of energy and reduce the amount of mining, and maybe mining asteroids could be a solution. I don't know. I'm not an engineer or an economist. So there might be a solution for mining asteroids. But if we lose track, or if we lose sight of those big questions, I think we're doomed.
Yeah, I think I would like our audience to think about these things. Do we know what we will do if we find life on Mars? Or what will happen if there's a conflict for resource extraction on the moon? And how do we deal with these political and ethical dilemmas? And are we prepared to deal with the consequences of our decisions and actions? I think these are things that I would want us and our listeners to think about. And finally, Juan, I have a bit of a crystal ball question for you. What will a multi-species future in space look like, say in 2050?
Multi-species futures in space. The first thing I can think of is that as part of that, of the species part, we should be considering non-organic species. AI, robots are part of this new combination. I don't think we need to speak only in terms of organic life, so humans and plants and microbes and animals. So I would add that part to that question. So I think there's going to be a lot of AI and different kinds of androids and robots in maybe a prototype phase by 2050, but playing an important role. And it brings me, I think the best way to answer this question is the novel 2312 by Kim Stanley Robinson, which is 300 years more than 2050. So I don't think 2050 is it's a long enough future, is just around the corner. But in that novel, which part of the plot is a terrorist attack by an AI entity that goes rogue, but the humans are more than humans, and that's something that we already are. So 50, 60, 70% of ourselves is not human. It's cell and microorganisms that are different to humans. So we're already more than human. But in 2050, I think there's going to be the beginnings of DNA manipulation. Like in the novel, people had, cat traits or, lion traits, hermaphrodite people, to extend life. So in order to extend life to 120 or 150 years old. People in that novel were of different genders at the same time. So I think the multi-species world is changing very rapidly as we speak, and maybe in 2050 it's going to be different. I think people with disabilities are going to have a really important role to play in space. I met a young man from Sydney, who had done tests in zero gravity and small spaces. He doesn't have his two legs, and he was very agile in zero gravity and small spaces. So there's a lot of also new ways for people with those kind of bodily disabilities to be really important in outer space. So I think we're going to see a very different take on ableism in outer space once we realize that our normal able bodies are not necessarily the most resilient in outer space. So I'm not sure if I'm responding to your question, but it's a difficult question. But I think it's like a Pandora box at the moment, and probably it's not just the human as defined in the 20th century that's going to be living in outer space. It's going to be a very different human living in outer space. Maybe not in 2050, but maybe by the 2050s, we're going to start seeing this unfolding.
Thank you. Thank you, Juan. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure for me too.
Thank you all for listening. Stay tuned for our next episode. Refer to our website, spaceportsarabhai.org, for more discussions, debates, dialogues, an explainer series, the new Space India podcast, and a newsletter about the progress of India's space program.